What if I told you?
What if I told you?
What if I told you
That there are a group of black Indians
that created the largest haven
in
the U.S. for escaped slaves?
in the 1700s? What if I told you?
What if I told you that there was a group of black Indians that led the largest slave revolt in U.S. history?
What if I told you that there were a group of blacks in the United States
That forced their own emancipation?
before the Civil War?
What if I told you
What if I told you that there were a group of black Indians
that led a mass exodus along the Trail of Tears and then right out of the United States?
What if I told you?
What if I told you?
What if I told you that this is the true story of the Black Seminoles, and you've likely never heard it before?
I never learned about them, and they were never in my history books.
This is a story about betrayal, distrust, backstabbing, and about a people that have been, for some reason, lost to history. This is about the Black Seminoles, the Black Indians,
And their long, remarkable journey to freedom.
Can't do this no more, Abigail. I won't.
What do you mean, Abraham? You're scaring me.
We've been slaves long enough now. I won't spend another day under the whip of these crackers.
Escape? Where can we go? You know they'll kill us. They'll kill
Florida.
us dead.
Florida. I heard them say it's free there. It's a chance, Abigail.
Florida? It's so far, Abraham, and it's dangerous.
I'll kill anybody that gets in our way. Staying here is death. We deserve better. You deserve better. We deserve a life free of these crackers.
Live free or die trying.
Live free, die trying. Them, along with several other enslaved Africans, made their way down to Spanish Florida. They fought slavers, bounty hunters, and many were recaptured and lost their lives along the way. But finally, several made it to freedom, at least for a while, in the swamplands of Spanish Florida.
During the same time period, there were several civilized indigenous populations scattered across these lands.
The term civilized tribes was applied to the major Native American tribes that took the bad medicine of the white man. They were classified as civilized because they had adopted the attributes of European culture, becoming Christians, sending their children off to re-education institutions, market participation, intermarriage with white Americans, and
Wait for it.
chattel slavery practices, including the purchase of enslaved Africans. Little did they know that the cotton reservations that they had would become cotton plantations after they were stolen and seized by the same white people they were emulating.
Hey guys, sorry for the shaky video in advance, but we are on our way to a town called Mosquis, and this is another town here in Mexico. But this town is the closest town we could get to Nacimientos, which is the town that a tribe, actually the Seminoles from the USA, kind of came over here to seek refuge during times of slavery. They are warrior people. They are a fierce people. There are some survivors, and it's not a whole lot of them there. So we're hoping that we're able to make some contact.
We've been exploring stories of how Africans made it here, and it's a variety of ways, but this community that we're going to is a completely different story and history of how they made it here.
So we're just praying for some favor as we go so we can show you guys, and so we can learn about the real deal here in Mexico and black people and their migration here. So see y'all there.
Yes, my name is Wendy Goodlow. I am a Black Seminole, and more specifically, I'm a descendant of the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts, which were the group of men that joined the military and fought for the military in the U.S. from 1870 to 1914. So I grew up in Brackettville around that history.
We had not found out about the Black Underground Railroad that led into Mexico. We had never heard about that before.
Yeah,
And
not
then
many
we
people
came to
have.
Mexico. But whoa, what you know about this Underground Railroad? What's going on? Black indigenous people moving to Mexico. What is this?
I know, it's It's a lot. That's what I always tell you. It's a lot of story. You know, the way that our elders began the story was that in the late 1600s, around 1680s into the early 1690s, there were what would become known as the Gullahs, but they were enslaved Africans living in the Low Country who took it upon themselves to seek their own freedom. So instead of going north, they went south into Florida because Florida at that time was a Spanish territory, so it was not part of the formation of the U.S. at that point. It was owned by the Spanish.
In 1687, 8 men, 2 women, and a nursing child escaped from Carolina to Spanish St. Augustine and requested baptism into the true faith. Florida's governor sheltered the runaways out of Christian obligation and refused to return them when an agent from Carolina came to reclaim them. The slaves' telegraph quickly reported this outcome, and soon other runaways began arriving in St. Augustine. Florida officials repeatedly solicited Spain for guidance, and finally, on November 7th, 1693, Charles II issued a royal proclamation
giving liberty to all, the men as well as the women, so that by their example and by my liberty, others will do the same.
Fort Jose was established freedom seekers who were making their way down from the Carolinas, escaping slavery. If they made it down to Spanish Florida, they could live free.
And once they got there, they found that there were already people there who were living free. There were formerly enslaved Africans, there were free blacks who were living on the land.
At Nero's town on the Swanee River, here on the Apalachicola River, even before the one here at Prospect Bluff, you had a settlement Nero Cheesy Bluff. They established a separate one where there were several hundred Maroon fighters. You had many settlements of free blacks all through Florida, particularly, late 1700s, early 1800s.
There were also Native Americans. At the same time that was happening, there was the group of Creeks who lived just north of Florida. And because of moral differences, they splintered into the Upper Creeks and Lower Creeks. And the Upper Creeks decided that they wanted to break away and go down into Florida to get away from the Lower Creeks who were taking on more European ways of life. And one of those was to begin chattel slavery. That's where the idea of the word Seminole comes from, is that some linguists believe that it is a Creek word or Muskogee word, and it's pronounced Seminole or Seminole. They believe it means runaway because these Creeks believed that part of their group was running away. And so it's also interesting that it fits for what would become the Black Seminoles because they were essentially running away as well. They formed their own villages but were interacting with the Seminoles, so they would become known as the Black Seminoles.
The African and indigenous people lived and worked closely together. And in time, they came to view themselves as a part of the same loosely organized tribe, cultivating a mutual respect of each other's cultures. The Africans adopted a lot of the Indian garb, and the Indians adopted African agriculture, music, and folklore. And they lived this way for over 100 years, raising generations of children in freedom. As Florida continued to be a haven for Black freedom, this didn't set too well with antebellum Georgia. They shared a border, and contentions were high. At this point, there was a lot of retaliation going on. The U.S. military launched raids, tried to steal slaves, steal cattle, and encroach on this Spanish land.
The United States felt that the existence of this community served as something of a beacon of freedom for slaves from Georgia and the Carolinas, or even the Creek Nation, to slip away from bondage and come down here seeking freedom in Florida.
In the spring of 1818, the U.S. government launched their attack.
As soon as the U.S. military was dispatched at the orders of Andrew $20 Jackson, this marked the beginning of the First Seminole War.
The 1818 battle at Swanee is again recorded by the U.S. military. The people referred to as Black warriors held off the U.S. troops.
The Seminoles, known as the Red Sticks in that area, and the Black Seminoles held their ground and held up their contract with the Spanish to defend the border.
They ultimately fell back, and the village was destroyed. Fell back to was the Manatee River, Tampa Bay, Angola.
At the conclusion of the First Seminole War, the Spanish sold Florida to the Americans for $5 million. This drove the Seminoles and the Black Seminoles deeper into Central Florida, deeper into the Everglades. It was here that the two bands grew closer, and it was also here that birthed two legendary leaders, Osceola for the Seminoles and John Horse, aka Abraham, to lead the Black Seminoles.
So the First Seminole War began between 1816 and 1870 when General Andrew Jackson went in and started a war.
I read somewhere that he was trying to recapture black formerly enslaved. They weren't even formerly enslaved at this period. They were never even
They were
slaves,
generations removed. Yeah, they were generations removed. And Andrew Jackson, he was the only president who ever ran on the idea of committing genocide. So he promised that he would wipe out, all Native Americans and return formerly enslaved Africans to their owners.
Andrew $20 Jackson was POTUS number 7. This wealthy Tennessee enslaver, known to be the poor white man's champion, with a base known for their riots and lynching, a presidency full of scandal, he would be best known for his deep hatred of black people and Indians, promising to deal with the banks, restructure the government, and deal with the nagging Indian problem holding the country back.
The Indian problem. This was the name given to indigenous Americans just living their life on their land, but land that the colonial settlers wanted. They wanted to take their land, their joy, their happiness, but especially that land.
There's almost a mythology about this, that somehow when the Pilgrims arrived, they were dragging land behind them. There was no land brought here. The land here was Native nations. And this is what the United States needed. It's what it wanted. They wanted all of it. They wanted everything.
Between 1830 and 1850, about 100,000 Native Americans were evicted at gunpoint from their ancestral homelands. They were escorted by the United States military to designated Indian territory in present-day Oklahoma. The relocation, known as the Trail of Tears, was the result of genocidal legislation called the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. Hey, what's up, family? Hope you guys are enjoying this video, and if you are, please consider sharing this video. We found so many lies and unearthed so many interesting things that we never knew, and we're hoping that you found some new things as well. We want to share it with the world. So sharing is caring, and if you guys care, share this thing so we can let the community know what's going on out here.
And if you'd like to see more content just like this, consider joining our Patreon, where you get a window seat into our travels and stories about the diaspora.
All right, y'all, back to the video. Share this thing.
So the First Seminole War happens, and then by 1838 is when the second one starts. So there is a span of about 20 years between. And within this time, the Seminoles and Black Seminoles have only gotten closer. The Black Seminoles are highly militarized. And so when the war does begin, they are out there on the front lines, so much so that General Jessup says, this is not an Indian war, this is a Negro war, because they were at the front lines.
General Jessup wasn't wrong. It was a black war. It was a Negro war. It was the largest Negro uprising the United States had ever seen, and it's in no history books anywhere. More than 300 enslaved individuals rose up against their plantations and came to join arms with the Black Seminoles to fight against the United States of America and for freedom. After the defeat of the First Seminole War, Andrew Jackson went on to become President of the United States of America, and he signed the Indian Removal Act. At his signing of this act, they knew that a war was coming, and they prepared accordingly. John Horse and his compatriots gathered the troops together. They went around to the local plantations all throughout Florida, rallying up the enslaved and telling them that they can get their freedom, and they listened. At his call, they all came to fight against the United States government. They fought tooth and nail with everything that they had and launched a 7-year war that cost the United States government more than they had ever spent and more than they would spend ever until the Vietnam War. They caused more casualties and more damage than any other slave rebellion in U.S. history. So why haven't you heard about it?
The reason that they fought so hard and were known for fighting was because for the Seminoles, they would just die. But for the Black Seminoles, they would be returned to slavery. So that was what they were fighting for and against. And so the thing was that they didn't just kill, they killed twice. You know, they wanted to make sure that their enemies were dead.
John Horse, being the excellent strategist and leader that he was, told the United States government that he would lay down his arms if and only if they would give them papers of emancipation for each and every one of his soldiers. And they agreed to this. So they put down their arms, and the Black Seminoles began their trek on the Trail of Tears, headed to modern-day Oklahoma. They lost lives as well, but I believe their disposition was a bit different from the other indigenous people that were on that trail. I believe that these Africans were looking forward to getting to that reserved place in modern-day Oklahoma. I believe they saw it as a new start and a new life that awaited them. But when they got there, they found old demons. They found broken promises. And they found that Uncle Sam is the same dirty uncle that he's always been.
But of course, everything changed by the time they got to Oklahoma.
This reservation wasn't their happily ever after, nor was it the end of their story. At this reservation, the U.S. Attorney General, Nathan Clifford, announced that the U.S. government didn't even have the authority to grant their freedom in the first place. In other words, their emancipation was essentially revoked.
Y'all, we have made it out here to the remotest of the remote.
We are in El Nacimiento de los Negros.
Now, out here, these people are the people that never bow down. You guys, their history dates way back. From North Carolina down to Florida, from Florida to Oklahoma, and from Oklahoma walked all the way into Mexico, a 6-month hike.
And made it here to freedom in 1850.
The story goes a little something like this.
But for the Black Seminoles, they were threatened with being captured and returned to slavery because it was outlawed territory. And so there were slave catchers there who...
Anyone with African features were being kidnapped and sold off in the night.
So pretty quickly, John Horse started looking for a way out.
A group of Black Seminoles led by the Wildcats, who was like the chief of the Seminoles, and John Horse, who was essentially the chief of the Black Seminoles, made their way down to Mexico. Mexico had abolished slavery, and it was a dream of both John Horse and Wildcat to make it to freedom, to make it here to Mexico. They got here in 1850 and settled in this town in the state of Coahuila called El Nacimiento de los Negros.
My name is Corina Torralba Harrington. I was born in Nacimiento, Coahuila, Mexico, Comunidad Negros Mascogos, and I migrated to the United States when I was about 7 years old.
When they made it to Mexico, it was the land of milk and honey. They were greeted with open arms because Mexico had a problem. They had raiding parties. The Comanche and Apache tribes were raiding all along that Mexican border. Also, the Americans were encroaching, as they do, all along that border. So Mexico received them with open arms, as they did for every Black self-emancipating individual. But for these people, they gave arms, they gave weapons, and land in the state of Coahuila, in a little city called Nacimiento. The Black Seminoles that settled in Mexico, particularly the ones that settled here in Nacimiento, were granted certain rights back in the 1850s for a particular set of reasons. They received land, they received supports from the government, and they received autonomy, which allowed them the ability to govern their own communities, have their own type of laws, as long as they assured the government that they would protect the border. At that time, the Apache tribes and Comanche tribes were raiding all along the border, and the United States was pretty much encroaching in the area, trying to get more and more land. And these guys settled here and ruthlessly defended the border. There are many recorded exploits of them chasing down Apache, Comanche, Americans, Texas Rangers. Their reputation did not even compare to what they really were. In fact, they defended that border so fiercely that after the Emancipation Proclamation, the United States military came knocking.
In 1870, the United States Army sent a message to the Black Seminoles chief, John Horse, inviting him to enlist with them to become Indian Scouts and help them fight the hostile Native Americans. They accepted because they were promised repatriation, but they also believed that they would be granted land, food, provisions, and reimbursements for traveling costs. But there's one thing about promises made to the Black Seminoles from the US government. Not a single one was ever kept.
You know, the amazing thing to me is that Mexico is really the only country or government that honored their promise. So out of the British, the Spanish, the Americans, the Mexicans were the only ones.
Despite this, the Black Seminoles fought fiercely alongside the Buffalo Soldiers, and not a single member of the Black Seminole Indian Scouts was killed or seriously injured despite all of their fights with hostile Native Americans. They never failed a mission, and several members received the highest honor in the military. After their services were no longer needed, they were kicked off the fort from which they had served and eventually settled in Brackenville, Texas. So walking around the streets of El Nacimiento de los Negros, it's a very small community, a very tight-knit community, and very quiet, but walking through the streets, you see the signs of their history.
It's just really cool being here. This area it's Afro. This area is distinctively different. Again, we had to travel a long way from a very small town just to get here. It's remote, and you know why it's remote. Have you been back lately at all?
Yes, I go back every Juneteenth because of our Juneteenth celebration there. It is different. I was very surprised when I found out that we actually celebrate Juneteenth down there. When I started learning all the history, I was like, well, why do we celebrate it? You know, if our people freed themselves, you know, they liberated themselves. Right. It was that important to them. They decided to have that celebration. You know, we've always known that celebration as El Baile de los Negros, o El Día del Negro, o El 19. So
it's a day of honor. That's beautiful. Yeah. So it's in solidarity almost. It's
yes, like, exactly. I also have a Casa de la Cultura there, and I'm wearing my shirt today. Oh, I love it. And so I go back for that a lot too, and other projects that I'm working on there.
I never knew about any Black Seminoles coming over to Mexico. I never knew about it until maybe last year.
So our history starts in Africa. Our people were the people that would rather die than be enslaved. To just tell, you know, everything that our people did, because I just want those kids to know who our people were, the warriors that they were brave, what they did. I want them to know what kind of people are their people, they come from.
So many people believe it was only one way, and that's not the way, that's not even the real way it was. We didn't just sit down and take it. We didn't just come over here and say, okay, we're just gonna be slaves. Yep, that's what we'll do, you know? No, not hardly. So that is the main reason I'm telling the story, so people can get the real information, the honest information.
Like, we have people that we know that are getting involved, you know, especially here in the United States, just being Native, you know, we're Native, we're not Black.
Yep.
So what all I have to say is to those people is, okay, you know, that's your story. This is my story, you know. If you're just Native, then you're not part of the Black Seminoles. That's not something that I'm making up. We cannot tell our story and take away our Blackness, our Africanness, our Negro, you know, whatever it is that you want to call yourself, we cannot tell our story taking that away.
Throughout this video, we have been diving into the cultural heritage and influences of the Black Mascojos, or the Black Seminoles, and it's so interesting because it's this mix of like American indigenous, it's a mix of African, and now that they've been settled here in Mexico for a while, it's a mix of Mexican also. It's really interesting to dive into and reminded me of diving into my own culture and history. We recently took DNA tests with MyHeritage to kind of dive in and find out what we're made of. If you're interested in finding out your heritage and diving into your culture as well, check out MyHeritage. They are one of the top family history and DNA services out there, and it's a great way to know what you're made of.